CEO follows employee working double shifts, home. What he saw shocked him. Lucas Carter was not born into success. He built it from the ground up. Every bit of his multi-million-dollar logistics empire, Carter Freight Solutions, was the result of tireless dedication, long nights, and sacrifices that few would ever fully understand. From a small, dimly lit office in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to a nationwide powerhouse, Lucas had spent years proving that hard work could turn ambition into reality. He had missed birthdays, lost friendships, and poured everything into the belief that effort was the great equalizer, that those who put in the work would eventually reap the rewards. And for him, that philosophy had paid off. Now, he sat in his sleek, glass-walled office, surrounded by financial reports, expansion plans, and industry forecasts that reaffirmed his success. He had built something stable, something undeniable. His company was one of the most reliable names in freight, a place where discipline and work ethic mattered above all else. Employees were expected to show up, work hard, and earn their way forward, just as he had done. He wasn't the kind of boss who involved himself in his workers' personal struggles. As long as they performed, their private lives were their own business. That was the system he had built, efficient, profitable, and fair in the only way he had ever known. But tonight something would challenge that belief. Something small at first, barely significant in the grand scheme of his business, yet unsettling enough to plant a seed of doubt in his mind. Because for all his confidence in the power of hard work, Lucas was about to realize that success was not as simple as effort alone. And for the first time in a long time, he would begin to question whether he had been overlooking something crucial about the people who made his empire run. Lucas Carter was wrapping up another long night in his office, reviewing financial reports and finalizing expansion plans, when something unusual caught his attention. Through the glass walls of his office he noticed movement in the cafeteria, which should have been closed by now. Curious, he leaned back in his chair and observed. It was Eva Mitchell, one of his employees. He knew her, not personally, but by reputation. She was one of those workers who never gave him a reason to worry, always punctual, always reliable, never the type to complain. If there was a crisis, Eva was the one who stepped up, taking on extra shifts without hesitation. She handled long hours like they were nothing, making her one of the most dependable employees in the company. And yet, something about the way she was acting tonight didn't sit right with him. She stood near the food counter, shifting her weight from foot to foot, casting quick glances around as if making sure no one was watching. Then, after what seemed like a moment of hesitation, she stepped closer to the kitchen staff. Lucas couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw the way the cook's expression changed, the way his brows pulled together in concern. There was a pause, an exchange of looks, and then, after a brief hesitation, the cook handed her a takeout container. Eva murmured a quiet thank you before quickly tucking the container into her oversized tote bag. She turned away, head down, walking with a hurried but deliberate pace, as if she didn't want anyone to see what had just happened. Lucas narrowed his eyes, watching as she disappeared down the corridor. Why would Eva Mitchell, one of the hardest-working employees in the company, need to ask for food? She worked more than most, often pulling double or even triple shifts. If anyone in his company should have been financially secure, it was her. And yet, there she was, accepting a free meal like someone who had no other choice. Lucas tried to shake off the thought, telling himself it wasn't his business. But as he glanced back at the report in front of him, the words blurred together. Something about this didn't add up, and for the first time in years, he felt compelled to find out why. Lucas Carter wasn't the kind of man who got involved in his employees' personal lives. He had built his company on the idea that hard work was the only currency that mattered, that what people did after they clocked out was their own business. But as he stepped out of his office that night, the image of Eva Mitchell accepting that takeout container lingered in his mind like an unanswered question. He tried to push it aside, rationalizing that maybe she just forgot her wallet or was in a hurry, maybe it wasn't his concern. And yet, before he even realized it, his feet were already moving, following the empty corridors of the building toward the parking lot. Outside, the air was sharp, the wind cutting through like a silent warning. Eva walked with purpose, but there was something about her pace, hurried yet heavy, like someone carrying an invisible weight. Lucas slowed his steps, observing. No car keys in hand, no pause to check her phone for a ride. Instead, She headed straight for the nearest bus stop. Lucas hesitated. This was crossing a line, but when the next bus pulled up and Eva climbed inside, he found himself doing the same, keeping enough distance to avoid being noticed. The ride stretched on, carrying them further and further from the city's polished business district. Lucas sat toward the back, watching as Eva rested her forehead against the window, eyes barely open, looking drained. Not just tired, but exhausted in a way that settled deep in the bones. No frustration, no visible anger, just quiet acceptance, as if this was normal for her. As the bus moved past familiar streets, the scenery began to shift. The bright lights of shopping centers faded into aging brick apartments, cracked sidewalks, and dim street lamps that flickered uncertainly against the night sky. Lucas rarely thought about these parts of town. They were places he drove past, not through. Eventually, Eva pulled the stop cord. Lucas watched as she stepped off, adjusting the strap of her bag before making her way down a narrow street lined with rusted railings and worn-out porches. She climbed a set of stairs to a small apartment complex, the kind that had seen better days, but still held the quiet resilience of people doing their best to make ends meet. She pulled out her keys, pushed open the door, and disappeared inside. Lucas slowed his steps as he reached the building, his mind racing. He could turn back now, he had already seen too much, but something inside him told him that this wasn't the full story. So, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he stopped in front of the window, looking in through the thin curtains. And what he saw changed everything. Through the thin curtains of the dimly lit apartment, Lucas Carter saw a reality he hadn't expected, one that hit him like a weight settling in his chest. The space was nearly empty, not in the way of someone who had just moved in, but in the way of someone who had been surviving with nothing for a long time. No couch, no dining table, no decorations, just a single mattress on the floor, covered with a thin blanket. A small plastic crate sat beside it, holding a few neatly folded clothes. The walls were bare, the floor scuffed, the entire place carrying the quiet struggle of someone barely holding things together. But then, two small heads peeked out from behind the mattress. Lucas stiffened, his breath catching as he realized the full picture. Children, two kids, no older than 5 or 6, crawled forward with wide, hungry eyes, their tiny hands reaching as Eva knelt beside them, opening the takeout container with careful hands. She split the food between them, watching as they ate with quiet urgency, not wasting a single bite. And Lucas noticed something else. She wasn't eating. She had asked for that meal, not for herself, but for them. He took a slow step back, his mind racing, his heart pounding with something unfamiliar. He had spent years building his company, pushing employees to work harder, demanding efficiency, believing that a paycheck was the ultimate reward. But had he ever stopped to wonder what happened after they clocked out? Had he ever considered that for some, a paycheck wasn't enough? Not because they weren't working hard enough, but because the system they existed in kept them just barely above the surface? He thought about the extra shifts Eva had worked, the late nights, the quiet exhaustion she carried. She wasn't just working, she was surviving. A gust of wind rattled a loose metal sign nearby, but Lucas barely noticed. He was frozen in place, still staring, still absorbing the truth that had been right in front of him all along. And then a small voice cut through the night, soft but sharp enough to make him stop breathing. "Mommy, are we going to have breakfast tomorrow?" Lucas clenched his jaw as Eva hesitated, her fingers gently brushing her daughter's curls. Her voice was steady, but Lucas recognized the kind of strength that was meant for someone else, not herself. "Of course, baby. I'll figure it out," she smiled, but it was the kind of smile that wasn't meant for comfort. It was meant to shield, to protect, to hide the uncertainty she wasn't allowed to show. And, in that moment, something deep inside Lucas shifted. This wasn't just an unfortunate situation. This was a broken system, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if just working hard was enough to fix it. But one thing was certain. He couldn't just walk away now. Lucas Carter sat at his desk the next morning, but for the first time in years he wasn't focused on work. His laptop screen displayed financial reports, emails, and expansion plans, yet none of it registered. His mind was elsewhere, stuck in the dimly lit apartment, replaying the moment he had seen Eva kneeling beside her children, dividing a single meal between them while going without herself. He had spent years believing that hard work was the great equalizer, that effort alone determined success. He had built his company around that belief, rewarding those who put in the hours and expecting that a paycheck was enough to sustain them. But last night had shattered that illusion. Eva had worked more shifts than most, had proven her dedication time and time again, and yet she was still barely surviving. The weight of that realization settled deep in his chest. If someone as hard-working as Eva was struggling to feed her kids, then maybe the problem wasn't effort, it was the system. And worse, it was a system he had been blind to, a system he had helped uphold without even realizing it. For the first time, Lucas questioned whether he had failed the very people who had built his success. He had always prided himself on efficiency, on ensuring his company ran like a well-oiled machine. But had he ever really looked at the gears that kept it turning? Had he ever considered the lives behind the numbers, the sacrifices behind the productivity? He had assumed that paying wages was enough, that as long as the numbers balanced, everything was fine. But last night had shown him that wasn't true. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face. This wasn't just about Eva. How many other employees were going home to empty apartments? How many were working double shifts just to keep their heads above water? He had always believed that his company provided opportunities, but what if it had also been trapping people in a cycle of exhaustion? Lucas clenched his jaw. He had spent his entire career solving problems, fixing inefficiencies, making things work better. And now, for the first time, he saw the real problem. This wasn't just a situation to be acknowledged. It was one that needed to be changed. And he was going to do something about it. Lucas Carter sat in his office, his fingers interlocked as he stared at the door, waiting. He had spent the entire night thinking, rethinking, and overthinking how to approach this conversation, but now that the moment had arrived, none of the words he had rehearsed felt right. A soft knock broke his thoughts. His assistant peeked in, her tone as professional as always. "Eva Mitchell is here to see you." Lucas nodded, taking a breath. "Send her in." The door opened and Eva stepped inside, looking just as exhausted as she had the night before, though now there was something else in her eyes. A quiet wariness, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. She took a seat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression unreadable. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Her voice was steady, polite, as if this were just another routine meeting. Lucas studied her for a moment, realizing just how much he had overlooked before. The tiredness in her posture, the way her fingers tightened slightly as she waited for whatever this was. He had spent years managing people, but had he ever really seen them? Finally he exhaled and spoke. "I saw you last night." Eva's posture stiffened immediately. "Excuse me?" "I followed you home." Her eyes snapped to his, her breath hitching slightly, and for the first time her carefully composed exterior cracked, just for a second, before she quickly put it back in place. I don't understand." Lucas leaned forward, keeping his voice steady. "I saw you take that food home. I saw your apartment, your kids." A flash of panic crossed her face, followed by something sharper, defensiveness. She shifted slightly, glancing toward the door as if calculating how fast she could leave if she had to. I don't need—" "I'm not here to judge you," Lucas interrupted, his voice firm but calm. "I'm here because I should have seen it sooner, and because I want to fix it." Eva swallowed hard, her hands now clenched into fists in her lap. "You don't have to do this." Her voice was quiet, almost fragile, but there was strength behind it too, the kind of strength that came from years of figuring things out on her own. "I know," Lucas said simply, "but I do." For the first time in a long time, Eva didn't know how to respond. She had spent so long carrying the weight alone, never expecting anyone to step in, but even the strongest people had breaking points, and Lucas had no intention of letting her reach hers, not this time, not just for her but for everyone like her. Lucas Carter had always been a man of action. He built his company on the principle that problems existed to be solved, that success wasn't about sympathy but about strategy, about making things work. And now, as he sat across from Eva Mitchell, Seeing the exhaustion etched into her features, he realized that this wasn't just about helping one person. It was about fixing a system that had been broken for far too long. He reached into his desk drawer, pulling out a thick envelope and slid it across the table toward her. Ava's eyes flicked down to it, then back to him, suspicion clouding her expression. "What is this?" Her voice was steady, but there was hesitation there too. Lucas met her gaze without flinching. "This isn't charity," he said firmly before she could protest. "This is an investment. In you. In the people who make this company run." She didn't move to take it. Instead, she studied him, as if trying to decide whether or not she could trust what he was saying. "I want to raise wages," Lucas continued, his voice steady but urgent. "I want to restructure hours, provide childcare support, emergency assistance, whatever it takes to make sure that no one else has to go home the way you did last night." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the desk. "And I need your help to do it the right way." Ava's lips parted, but no words came out. She had spent so long figuring things out on her own that the idea of someone offering real, tangible change felt almost impossible. Her fingers hovered over the envelope before drawing back, as if it might burn her. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you care now?" Lucas exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Because I built this company believing that hard work was enough," he admitted. "But I was wrong. People don't just need jobs, they need support. They need to know that someone sees them, that someone actually gives a damn." Silence settled between them, heavy yet different from before. It wasn't filled with tension or uncertainty. It was filled with something closer to possibility. Slowly, Eva reached out, her fingers brushing against the envelope before finally gripping it. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, swallowing hard. She wasn't used to accepting help, wasn't used to anyone even offering it. Lucas held her gaze. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." For the first time in a long time, Eva nodded. Not in resignation, but in something that almost resembled hope. Eva sat motionless, her fingers tightening around the envelope, as if trying to decide whether to hold onto it or push it back across the desk. For so long she had survived on her own, relying on nothing but sheer determination to keep herself and her children afloat. Help wasn't something she expected. It wasn't something she had ever waited for. She had learned early that if she wanted something done, she had to do it herself. But now, staring at the envelope, at Lucas Carter, the man who built this company, who had always seemed so far removed from the struggles of workers like her, she felt something unfamiliar creeping in. Doubt? Hope? A mix of both? Lucas, watching her carefully, leaned forward. "This isn't a handout, Eva. It's a step forward." His voice was steady, firm, but not commanding. He wasn't demanding that she take it he was offering, and that alone made it harder to refuse. Eva exhaled sharply, her jaw tightening. "I don't want pity." Lucas nodded. "Good, because that's not what this is." She hesitated again, glancing toward the door as if she could escape the moment if she wanted to, but she didn't move. Instead, she swallowed hard and looked back at him. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice quieter now, more vulnerable than she intended. Lucas didn't look away, neither do I. And somehow, that made it easier. Slowly she loosened her grip on the envelope and opened it, her breath catching slightly at the amount inside. It wasn't just a bonus. It was enough to breathe, to plan, to finally do more than just scrape by. Her throat tightened, her vision blurred for just a second before she forced herself to steady. She wouldn't cry, not here, not now. Instead, she let out a shaky breath and nodded once, firm and final. "Okay." Lucas exhaled too, as if he had been holding his own breath. "We start today." And just like that, for the first time in years, Ava allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Lucas watched as Ava stood, the envelope clutched tightly in her hands, and for the first time he saw something shift in her posture. Not just exhaustion, not just quiet endurance, but something closer to relief, to the idea that she no longer had to carry everything alone. But this wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about one employee in one difficult situation. It was about all the others just like her. the ones he had overlooked for years because he had convinced himself that a paycheck was enough. As Eva walked out of his office, Lucas leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, his mind already moving to the next steps. He wasn't interested in temporary fixes. He had spent his career solving problems, optimizing processes, making things run smoothly, and now, for the first time, he saw his company itself as the problem. If Carter Freight Solutions was going to be the kind of business he had always believed it was, a place where hard work actually paid off, then he had to make real, lasting changes. He pulled up financial reports, running calculations, breaking down how wages could be restructured, how benefits could be expanded without compromising the company's stability. He made calls, setting up meetings with department heads, human resources, financial officers. This wasn't just about offering help when someone was at their breaking point. It was about ensuring that no one ever reached that point to begin with. He wanted to implement on-site childcare options, emergency relief funds for workers facing crises, and flexible scheduling for those who needed it most. No more expecting people to survive impossible hours with no safety net. No more ignoring the human cost of profit. For years he had measured success in numbers, in revenue growth, in expansion charts. But now he realized success wasn't just about how much the company grew, it was about how many people it lifted along the way. This wasn't a public relations move. It wasn't about image or corporate responsibility. It was about doing what should have been done all along. And as he finalized his plans, Lucas knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. Life teaches us that hard work is essential, but it also reminds us that effort alone is not always enough. The story of Lucas Carter and Eva Mitchell highlights a truth that many have seen throughout their lives. Sometimes, people work tirelessly and still struggle to get by. This isn't because they lack dedication or perseverance, but because the systems around them are flawed, leaving them trapped in cycles that seem impossible to break. For older generations who have witnessed decades of societal and economic changes, this story is a powerful reminder that success is not just personal, it is also communal. A strong community, workplace, or society is built not just on individual achievement, but on how well we take care of one another. For many who have spent their lives working hard, raising families, and sacrificing for the next generation, this lesson is especially meaningful. It encourages us to look beyond our own experiences and acknowledge the struggles of others, to recognize that fairness is not always guaranteed, and that sometimes even the most resilient people need support. It challenges the belief that those who struggle simply haven't tried hard enough, and instead asks us to consider the barriers they face. This story also serves as a call to action for business owners to see their employees as people, not just workers, for communities to create safety nets instead of judgments, and for individuals to step in when they see someone struggling rather than looking away. True success is not measured by wealth alone, but by how many people we lift up along the way. In the end, the real lesson is this: kindness and awareness have the power to change lives, and it is never too late to start making a difference.